Garry Kasparov entered the fray once more and took part in the Grand Chess Tour Blitz tournament in Zagreb. I'm afraid his participation was not a resounding success. He scored half out of 9. He was playing some of the strongest players in the world, but even so, it was obviously a devastating blow to him. He even lost one game in 7 moves. Let me show you that. Shahriar Mamedyarov playing with the white pieces. Queen's Gambit accepted, which Kasparov used in the latter part of his career. E5, that's the recognized way that you play against E3. But I rather like this setup for white. Knight F3 from Mamedyarov. Pawn takes pawn. And bishop takes pawn. So it's a slightly tricky move order from Mamedyarov. Of course, if black takes here, then you can play bishop takes f7. A nice little trick, pretty obvious. Well, Gary just played a normal developing move here. Knight f6. But unfortunately, that is an awful mistake. Here, black should just check on b4 and just bring knights out, for example, and the position is fine for black. It's roughly level. But Gary played knight f6, allowing queen b3 with a deadly attack on the weakest square, f7. Now, if that's protected with the queen, then knight e5. If bishop e6, well, it's clear this is absolutely terrible. This can be taken, b7 is on. It's a dreadful position. Gary played queen e7. I mean, maybe there's a chance to give a check here to exchange queens, but no. Mamedyarov played castles kingside, and here Kasparov resigned. Now, that is a little premature. However, it's a miserable position for black. This was round 6. Gary was already on half out of 5. So already really demoralized. But okay, let's see why he resigned. Well, let's say knight c6. Then we can take. And white is simply threatening to pile on the e-file, and that's horrible. Here, knight c3. I mean, white can just exchange pieces here, and it's dreadful. Here, bishop g5. There's a rook about to come to e1. I mean, this is just absolutely horrible. Alternatively, d3, attempting to keep the e-file closed, then knight g5 hits f7, and well, here white can play in a number of different ways, but you can just take and, well, just queen takes d3. White is a pawn up with an excellent position. Obviously black's king has been displaced. It's absolutely awful. So it was a little premature. However, it is just a horrible position for black. I want to show you actually another game that Kasparov played against Anand, and this is a far more interesting game. So Anand, this was in the 4th round. So Kasparov already on half out of 3. Anand with the white pieces. Anand had a good tournament. He finished with 5.5 out of 9 on this first day. But I was very interested in this game because it's a Najdorf. And I was fascinated to see the variation that Kasparov chose to play against bishop g5. Now, in the old days, he used to play the poison pawn variation with queen b6, which is really the acid test of bishop g5. Well, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave is a great exponent of this, but he has had problems, as we saw in the candidates tournament, with queen b6 and in Vaikonze as well. But I have a feeling that Kasparov was just too rusty to risk playing the poison pawn variation. He wouldn't have been up with all the variations. So he selected a pragmatic move, Queen c7. Now, he'd already played this in round 1 and round 3 and lost against Van Foreest and Duda. So it's quite risky to persist with this. Nevertheless, that's what he did. But I think Anand would have been quite pleased to see this because, well, this was the variation that Kramnik had selected against him in the last round of the World Championship match in 2008 with Kramnik in a must-win situation to keep in the match. But Anand negotiated the complications very well. In that game, he actually played f5 and got a good position. But, well, on this day, he played queen f3. And it's really interesting to see the strategy that Anand employs. b5, of course, normal move. e3, knight c6. So Van Foreest had simply taken on c6, but Anand castles. Knight d4, rook d4. And against Duda, Kasparov had tried rook b8, but it didn't end well. But in this game, he played queen c5, hitting the rook, and rook d3, and then rook b8. So Kasparov is angling to play pawn to b4, just to break open that b file and get some play against the king. It's a curious line, of course, because black is just keeping these pieces at home. The bishops can live at home, but they're hoping to break into the position at some point in the game. And of course, it's risky because it's not just that the king is in the middle, because actually the king isn't in real danger at the moment. It's the fact that this rook doesn't get into play. If we could magically just plonk the rook on c7, I think black would be very happy here. But because the rooks are split, black isn't coordinated, it's difficult. But anyway, Anand's next move is, I think, really remarkable. b4. Now this is really ambitious, or let's just say very bold for a blitz game. It damages white's king position to some extent. However, it does hold black's attack back just for a moment. And then if black's attack on the queen side isn't happening, then that shifts the whole dynamic of the position. So let's see, f5. So, black could at some stage perhaps try to sack a pawn with f5 and bishop g7 or something like that. So f5 closes that down and also, hopes to open the king side as well. a5, of course, Kasparov wants to open up the queen side. But here's Anand's idea, knight a2. So even though white's pawns get damaged a bit, this knight is going to find a good square on b4. Fascinating stuff, actually. And it's very hard for black to actually make progress on the queen side. Bishop e7. Bishop e2, Anand starts to develop and bring this king's rook into play. h5. Well, it's a pretty standard move to take away squares, like the h5 square is taken away from the queen or bishop. King b1. And that's also a kind of standard response just to bring the king away from a dart square. Bishop d7. And rook d1. So Anand has found pretty good coordination here, doubling on the d file. h4. Yeah, that means the rook can now move away. And here's very, very interesting. Anand decides just to break things open. Pawn takes pawn. And then knight b4. So this knight reaches this square. It's always said that Anand loves playing with knights. And this is a really good example of that. He's been really creative and found a great square for it. And the rook and the queen both protect the a3 pawn. So it's really hard to see how black can break through there, actually. Rook c8. However, the rook switches to the c file. That looks pretty reasonable. Now, okay, a question for you. How... I mean, I think White's position looks quite nice, but how are you going to make progress, actually? What should White play here? It's not an easy one, I have to say. Remember, this is the blitz game. But, you know, Anand, I think, came up with a kind of logical idea here. Anand played Queen g4, looking to come into g7. It's interesting, the computers actually like rook takes pawn, just giving up the exchange. And, well, I mean, the compensation is obvious. Having got rid of that dark squared bishop, then, you know, White can seek to operate on these dark squares. Maybe breaking things open like this. But it you know, the position is still very much in the balance, actually. So I'm not surprised that Anand rejected that. Even if theoretically, objectively, it's actually good for White. In practice, especially in a blitz game, not easy to control. So I think Queen g4 is somehow a far more practical move and more typical of Vichy, actually. You know, he's a classical player, a practical player. So he wants to come down to g7. So king f8. And then he took on e6. So one of the points is that if f takes e6, which is really the move we would like to play with black, to keep these pawns together and controlling these squares here. But the problem is that it starts to open up the king. So, you know, g3 is very inviting, and, you know, the files start to open. And while black's king, well, looks a bit insecure now, actually. So Kasparov took with the bishop. So Anand, in a positional sense, has achieved something there. Even though the king is still okay, you can see that the d5 and potentially f5 squares can be used for White's pieces. So queen f3 played. Obviously the queen was attacked. And rook c5. So, well, I mean, you could say Anand has gained something because he has some control over d5. But Kasparov has also gained something, actually. You know, this bishop has emerged, that's one thing. But this rook actually looks pretty good on the 5th rank. It might be that black can now play king g7, because the rook potentially can cover on the 5th rank, and that would allow rook number 2 to swing over. And once the rooks are connected, then actually black's position doesn't look bad. Then, you know, you can start to target this pawn, for example. So I think the position's still very much in the balance. Queen e3. I mentioned that critical last round game in the World Championship in 2008 against Kramnik. And Anand, quite early on in the game, played the queen to e3, and it was a crucial move in that game, actually. A very strong move. The queen often sits on e3 in these positions, actually, taking some control over the dark squares. I'm sure Vichy had a memory of that game in his head. But like I said, I think Kasparov's position is actually okay here. He played f5, which is very risky. Positions start to open up. It's also probably not a bad move, but it's risky. King g7, I think, is a safer move, with the idea of bringing the rook over. If knight d5, we can take. Now, the queen hits the bishop, so the queen would have to come back to defend it, and then rook c8. And black has counterplay. I don't think black is worse here. And you can see the king is reasonably secure, actually. can always just nudge back to f8 if necessary. But Kasparov played f5, which I think is, well, it's definitely risky, just in practical terms, because diagonals start to open up. In fact, rook takes pawn. This is very powerful now. Hitting this rook, queen c7 and queen d4 is incredibly strong. But I mean, these kind of sacrifices not easy to see in a blitz game. Anand, a very practical player, simply played bishop f3. No doubt he was playing quickly. Apparently, I mean, I didn't see this game live. Apparently, Kasparov had problems coping with time. And black is still okay here. Bishop f6 is still okay for black. But Kasparov took on e4, and then he made a blunder, rook c4. In fact, if he plays rook h5, connecting the rooks, dare I say it, black is still okay here. It's really interesting. And as I said, sometimes that king can just emerge on g7. But on f8, it's pretty secure. And these rooks are connected. And yeah, on e5, well, that's a beautiful square, actually, for the rook. Kasparov played rook c4. Well, it's a tempting move, because you can see that there is potential to take on b4. Anand played bishop d5, but that's a strong move. Once these bishops are exchanged, then white is looking really good. And you can see that Anand, like I said, a very practical player. He's kept real harmony in his position. All his pieces work well together. Bishop f6. Now there is really a threat to take here and give mate. So bishop takes rook. Pawn takes. Well, no doubt Kasparov was hoping that this exchange sacrifice would be effective, but after rook takes d6, well, in fact, he just resigned here. It is simply very, very good for white. Now, I don't know whether he lost on time or whether he just had enough of this position. I don't know. But it certainly is very, very pleasant for white. I mean, the obvious move is to bring this rook into play with king g7. But then rook takes bishop. And queen takes. White is 2 pawns up and threatens a devastating check on d7. And if queen e5, well, I mean, this should be a lost endgame, basically. But I thought that was a very interesting game, actually. I think up to a certain point, I think Giri played pretty well. But he obviously just lacked that practical sense that comes through regular playing, actually. It's not easy to pick that up again, just like that. And yes, he lost 3 games with this particular queen c7 variation of the Najdorf, which is a very interesting position, but yeah, I think you need to be really, really on your toes. Let me just show one finish, which I thought was really nice, from the game between Giri and Anand. Giri also had a pretty good day. He scored 5.5. Nepo's scored the best. He finished the day on, let me see. No, excuse me. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave finished the best. He had 6.5 out of 9. And Nepo had 6. Giri and Anand with 5.5. So this is the game Giri against Anand. And white to play and win. I'll give you a few moments just to think it through before I give you the solution. White to play and win. Looks like Anand has actually sort of found his feet here. Queen and bishop looking at the f-pawn. Feels like it's okay for black. If there's an exchange here, then black seems pretty secure. But Giri found a spectacular move here that wins the game beautifully. Lovely tactic. For a blitz game, this is really good stuff. He found bishop f4. So what's the threat? Well, just taking material for a start, and the threat is rook g6 mate, I should say. Pawn takes bishop. This is the game, and there is no defense basically. The threat. Well, let's see a couple of threats. One threat is to take here, and then mate next move. Another threat is to give a check here, and then bishop d1 is mate. So two threats. If, let's see, if knight f8, that covers the g6 square, but this, let me see, yeah, check, and here, that's right, and queen here. Oops, queen h6, for example. And in the game it went queen takes f2, and rook g6 was a nice winning move. If king h5, check, and bishop takes, and mate next move. You can choose whichever way you want. Queen takes, or queen h6, or rook h6. They're all mate. Let me play that one. That's kind of nice. There we go. Lovely finish. Let me just show that again. Bishop f4. Beautiful move with, well, multiple threats. But the king does not survive there. Well, thanks very much for watching. I do hope that Garry Kasparov does pick up in the second day at the Blitz, which we shall see. It's tough. He's 58 years old and is simply very, very rusty. And I think it shows, well, I don't think it frankly shows that it's tough for Kasparov, but it shows the level you need to play serious professional chess. You know, it's not just about opening preparation. It's being sharp, practically sharp, having a good practical sense of the game and the flow in the game, and to be able to spot tactics just like that as well. It's tough.